I think whether we like it or not, it's not very compelling to hand people just a list of rules and say, do this, don't do this. But well, why? And how is this connected to the rich story of who Jesus is for us? As people in our culture look at Christians and say, there's something strange about how you live, about the choices you make, about what you do with your bodies. I want Christians to be able to say, well, we're doing this not just because God said so, but because this actually reflects the character of God and the redemptive love of God that's revealed in Jesus.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. It's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, wherever you get your podcasts. And once again, if you like our show, please take a moment to review it on your favorite platform to let more people know about these interviews, these great guests who are helping us see that our worldview changes everything. My guest today is Director of Theological Education and Professor of Theology at the Foundry in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's a pastor, author, speaker, teaches on a wide variety of topics in theology, philosophy, and biblical studies, and serves on the collaborative leadership team for the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and as Director of Faith Formation at Fourth Reformed Church in Grand Rapids. So today he's joining me to talk about the dominant myths in our culture that relate to sexuality and how God can give us a grand vision that leads to wholeness and healing. Our bodies matter. Please welcome Branson Parler to the show. Branson Parler, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation because there's so many things that you do in this new book, Everybody's Story, that relate directly to some of the big issues that we are facing in our culture at this particular moment. So I just want to say thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for being willing to have a conversation about things that are tough for our society at this moment.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation and the impulse to try to think through the big picture, how when we're talking about some of the topics at hand, we're not just thinking about specific topics, but have to back up and see the big picture, ask the kind of foundational worldview story questions that really, I think, can illuminate a lot of these areas.
Well, we're going to go deep into this today. So for people who are watching or listening, and you've been seeing a lot of news about transgender or about other aspects of sexuality, the over-sexualization of culture, things like this, and you're wondering how Christians ought to be thinking about these issues, you're going to want to stay tuned for the next 40 or so minutes as we dig in to these issues. But I want to say, Branson, right off the bat, our Catholic friends seem to have had a better grasp historically on what we would call a theology of the body, the relationship between the body and the soul. And that's not my tradition. I know that's not your tradition, but I'm curious if you would just talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think it is, I didn't grow up in that tradition either. And it was, for me, very interesting and enlightening when I first, probably in 2008, 2009, came across some of the writings of John Paul II, popularized by Christopher West, and in some ways took a deep dive. And I thought, wow, this is really rich stuff that even for me as a Protestant, I was like, some of this I haven't thought about but much of this actually makes good sense. And so again, depending on your background or how you might approach these things, in teaching college students, I sometimes found there was some suspicion, some question, but I thought, wow, here is a tradition that really takes the body seriously and gives a theological account that was much richer than I experienced in my tradition growing up. And so it's pretty, I think, helpful to approach different Christian traditions with an open mind to see what strengths and weaknesses there are as we engage.
Let's talk about that question in relation to sexuality. So you mentioned John Paul II and his work on a theology of the body. flowing out of a need at that moment to properly understand biblical sexuality. And in your book, you talk about different myths about sexuality that are common in our time. Let's just review those for a moment, because I think we're going to see tie-ins to things that we're seeing even on the news every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in the book, I look at three different myths, three from the secular culture and three that I would say I've experienced in more Christian culture. And the three, especially of the secular culture, that I think really drive much of the particular topics or issues are the myth or the story of individualism that really says you do you, that you belong to yourself, and your main goal in life is really to find yourself, understand yourself, and express yourself in whatever way you see fitting, whatever that looks like to you. Second myth is the myth of romance, which says you complete me, that looks for a significant other in many ways as the one in whom we find meaning in this life. And so romantic relationships are, in a lot of ways, the be all and end all of how we look at things. And then the third myth is really the myth of naturalism, or some people might say materialism. The point is that our bodies are nothing, we are nothing but matter in motion. And so it's interesting to see how these three, they're not identical, but they're all very much related in terms of how our broader culture operates. That in part because my body is nothing but matter in motion, it's up to me to define my body, who I am, how I understand myself, who I would see as a romantic significant other, and all those pieces. So I think understanding those really can be a key that unlocks a lot of doors for framing the particular topics that might arise in our current culture.
You know, it seems to me that each one of those puts a lot of pressure on some aspect of our being. If all truth is up to you as an individual and you don't get it, there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that you're the only one who can fix it, but you can't.
Yeah.
And then the romance idea, it just offloads all of that pressure onto another person. Like if I'm not feeling complete, it's because it's your fault. You're not completing me. And then of course the myth about nature, essentially says it's all fate. There's nothing I can do about any of this. And so now I have no answers that I can find at all. How are those pressures affecting society? I mean, talk a little bit about the experiences of you work with a lot of young adults. So
I mean, I think you see with the first one, right, there's this sense that it really is up to me to define and understand and express myself, which might on the front end seem kind of liberating. Nobody else can tell me what to do. But on the other hand, like you said, then there's this huge amount of pressure to sort of uncover my authentic self, my true self, whatever that is, or really maybe to invent myself. And so when I think about the philosophers from the past century who talked about this, they actually used words like anguish and despair and anxiety as key markers. Like when there is no God, there is no truth. That does put this enormous pressure on the individual. And so you see this sense of people feeling like they have to invent themselves, completely figure themselves out with no script, no input, nothing to look to but themselves. Which, of course, the irony in all this, of course, is this is a story, a myth that is just saturating our culture. So it's not as though this is something that people are just themselves inventing. It's a story that they're being told. And then I think it creates this pressure where you do have, especially I see in young adults, a sense of what script really do I follow? How do I even understand who I'm supposed to be when there's nothing there to hang on to? So I think that's one example from that story, and of course you see it in others as well with something like the myth of romance. There's a sense, even at a very young age, I think that kids have to define themselves and others around some kind of romantic relationship, or again, even at very young ages, start to identify some sense of sexual orientation or gender identity in a way that, again, it puts all this pressure on, in some cases, middle schoolers or elementary age kids to wrestle with these enormous questions that really they're not equipped for, and really shouldn't be having to process in the way that they are. And so I think when you look around and you see a fair amount of confusion and pressure and anxiety, it grows out of these foundational myths, these foundational stories that really infuse our culture.
Yeah. Well, I love the term myths in this situation. You're not talking about something. You're talking about what's the narrative that is being used there. Like if you had students come to class and you said, "Okay, it's script writing class today. Just write down some lines." The question you want to ask is, what story is being told here?
Yes.
How am I going to write down these lines if I don't know what story is being told? And if the story is just you, or just the other person, or just nature, lostness would be the sort of the natural condition.
Yeah. That it's kind of this script in our culture that there is no script. You make it up, do whatever you want. And I think, again, that's not actually how we're wired as human beings, that we are created as cultural beings to, in some sense, inherit some script, some stories, some understanding of how do I find myself in this world and understand what I'm supposed to do.
Now we've got to talk a little bit too, sort of inside the church. There have been attempts, so people who have Christian convictions fundamentally sense that the Bible ought to inform all of these things, that we ought to have an answer. But a lot of the times the way sexuality has been approached in the church has not risen to the level of the cultural need. And I hope I hope that doesn't come across as condemning of believers, because we're doing our best, of course. But what are some of the things that have been happening in the church that are just not quite getting the whole picture?
Yeah, I think that you're right. And in saying this, I say this as somebody who grew up in the church. I love Jesus. I love the church. And so to wrestle with the shortcomings of the church, I think, is not to point a finger of condemnation, but rather to say, how do we continue to get better at this task that Jesus has given us of making disciples, of communicating in clear and compelling ways? And so this is where I think, when I look at my experience, the experience of my college students over the years, I think the way that I would think about the main shortcoming is that we've often framed all of this, questions about sexuality, marriage, gender, bodies, in a lot of ways primarily through the lens of the law, not the lens of the gospel. And to think through, how does the gospel actually shape the story, the true story that we're telling about bodies, sex, marriage, and singleness? And so this is where in the book I unpack these different stories or myths that have unfolded in the church context. Things like the myth of legalism, which says primarily you behave yourself, get your act together, do the right things, avoid the wrong things. And it's not necessarily bad, right? Scripture is filled with commands, but to understand those as framed through the lens of the gospel and the love of God for us, to understand the way that his faithful covenant love is really at the heart of the call to embody marriage and singleness in the way that Scripture talks about. And so I want the church to be able to tell a rich, compelling story about who Jesus is and about how our bodies and the story of our bodies are connected to the body of Jesus in his faithful covenant self-giving love, so that we then start to think about marriage and singleness and sex through that lens versus, I think, whether we like it or not, it's not very compelling to hand people just a list of rules and say, do this, don't do this. But, well, why? And how is this connected to the rich story of who Jesus is for us. And so that's really what I hope that as people in our culture look at Christians and say, there's hopefully, for good or for ill, there's something strange about how you live, about the choices you make, about what you do with your bodies. I want Christians to be able to say, well, we're doing this not just because God said so, but because this actually reflects the character of God and the redemptive love of God that's revealed in Jesus. And so those are the links that I think sometimes are missing in our account of sexuality and gender.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not sure exactly where to go with this, but I wanted to talk about the embodied nature of our sexuality for a moment. I think there's a sense in the culture right now, and it's likely a social media contagion where people sort of they don't see male and female as being relevant. They might actually say I was born in the wrong body or something of that nature. They see it more as, well, there's a spectrum with extreme masculinity on one end, extreme femininity on the other, and we're all somewhere in between. Whereas a biblical view gives you male and female, but then in the church, when we try to talk about that, we always end up in these debates about egalitarianism versus complementarianism and things like that. Can you give us some guidance about maleness and femaleness in relation to everybody's story?
Yeah. This is where I think part of what Scripture does is takes our bodies very seriously. Like our bodies are not throwaway, our bodies are not meaningless, our bodies are not plastic. And so when you see Scripture start out with this narrative of God creating us as male and female, that there's something to our embodied nature that reveals both something about who we are as male and female, but also reveals something about who God is, that it is who we are as male and female together, this unity in difference that reflects God, that is needed to image God in the world. And so one of the things I think that is where Genesis is different from both kind of contemporary cultural theory and to some degree in the church, the way that people then try to sort out all those questions about exactly what does this mean, is that gender is really in Scripture something that is received, not something that is achieved. And so when you look at our culture, I think there's the tendency to say gender is totally something that you can decide for yourself, in some sense, whatever suits you best, and then live into that, whether that's more masculine or feminine or something in between or non-binary. And so it makes gender really something that is the result of something we do. And to some degree, I think even in Christian circles, we end up making, masculinity or femininity or manhood or womanhood something that we achieve. We have to act a certain way or we're filling certain roles. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, because at the root of Genesis 1 is this sense that it's something that we receive. It's embodied. It's who we are as biological, spiritual creatures. And so we take those things very seriously. And because of that, the way that I often approach this is really to understand the way that who we are as male and female is rooted in our bodies and in that sexual difference that makes us who we are. That sexual difference that actually allows for the possibility of life. So again, right off the bat in Genesis 1, we image God in this way. And the first thing God says is be fruitful and multiply. There's that sense of it's male and female together who are able to be life givers, life bearers in the world. And to focus primarily on that, and then to recognize what does that look like and how does that work itself out within the individuality and even in different cultures, what it looks like to be masculine according to, current American stereotypes may or may not be all that helpful biblically. And you're going to see cultural diversity around the world as well. So to make sure that we're anchored in who we are as biological spiritual creatures first, rather than identify any sort of one cultural stereotype as that's what it means to be masculine, that's what it means to be feminine.
Wow, I think that's really clarifying. That's helpful because we know biologically, there's 6,500 catalog differences between males and females. It's not like they're interchangeable. It's not like by taking hormones, you can move from being one to being the other. But there's still that cultural sense of the stereotypes, which end up weirdly, and I'm just editorializing here, getting enshrined by some of the gender ideology that you see. In other words, it says, this is the stereotype, therefore this is true, and that's what we reject. Is there such a thing as a male or not just male or female bodies, but how do our bodies and our spirits interact as males or females?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, here's where, at least for me, I want to be really careful to not kind of say more or less than Scripture does.
Yeah.
And so I do think there's this difference and distinctiveness between male and female, but to also recognize there are numerous shared human characteristics in terms of how we function. And so, as you said, I think what I would want to avoid is kind of enshrining one cultural stereotype around what that is or what that means or what that looks like. But I think it does mean that we have to recognize that who we are as male and female is going to shape how we relate to God and how we relate to each other. And that in some ways, my distinctiveness, like I think about this in relationship to my wife, as a man, there are certain things biologically, culturally that shape me that are both good things and limits to what I can do, what I see, what I operate. And for her as a woman, again, there are many things we share in common, but there are distinctive certain things that she's going to understand, be aware of, be in tune with in ways that I'm not. And it's really this sense of recognizing the togetherness, the need for both of those as being really critical. And so to erase those distinctives or just to act like they're interchangeable, I think is going to miss out on, in a deep way, how God is imaged through our distinctiveness as male and female.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that because as a male, my everyday experiences are interacting with my maleness, and I'm going to experience, my wife and I could be in the exact same situation and experience it somewhat differently and grow differently because of our embodiment.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be a really helpful way to navigate the stereotypes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That we don't become in that way. We don't, I think I'm constantly trying to avoid two extremes, and that is either just like you said, reifying the stereotypes or just erasing the difference. And so to recognize the distinctiveness and uphold that, I think to me is a helpful way to kind of draw those boundaries.
Branson, let's talk about singleness for a little bit. As we mentioned, you've worked with college students a lot. You work with a lot of young adults. Many of them are single, maybe most of them. And I'm wondering if there has, if because it's been a long time since I've had that experience of singleness. Is there a sense that the church sort of gives singles the impression that you're not quite complete because you're not married, you're not in a oneness relationship? And how are we to understand singleness from a biblical view?
Yeah, I do think, now again, this can vary from church to church and maybe context to context, but on the whole, I would say most churches do maybe not overtly, but in a lot of ways, very subtly, will, or in some cases not so subtly, will say singleness is really a second class status. That the preference is to get married. And so, teaching at a Christian college for 13 years, a lot of times, for students, when they would come and then they would go back home, a lot of the questions would be, well, have you met somebody? Are you dating? Are you engaged?
Have you gotten your MRS degree?
Yes. Yeah, those kind of things. And again, I don't think people necessarily had, I think a lot of times people just didn't realize that what they were signaling was this sense that being single is not enough. Being single is missing something, in a way that I think doesn't actually fit, especially with how the New Testament talks about singleness. The way that Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 says, look, it's just as good, if not better, to be single and to be content with being single, to, in some ways, maybe even see singleness as the default assumption rather than marriage as the default assumption. And so I think we sometimes miss how, in that culture and society, it would have been radical to say, it's okay to be single. And it would have been assumed that you need to get married partly just to sustain yourself economically. Your family is your social security, particularly for women. And so for Paul to say to a church, even the women, hey, you don't have to rush out to get married, it is, I think we maybe don't have a radical understanding of the nature of the church, and how God forms the church to be this new family where that's our first family, so that in some ways marriage becomes optional. It's good. Paul's very clear about that. It's not a bad thing. It's not sinful to be married. It's not sinful to have sex with your spouse. But I wonder if we've kind of, we often go through these pendulum swings in church history where, at certain points it's like singleness is great, marriage is bad. And then other points it's like marriage is great, singleness is bad. And can we find a way to articulate, I think, a biblical balance that says these are two different good pathways for Christians to pursue as part of the family of God.
Help us with young singles for a moment. Let's say you're in a conversation, and it seems like I've had these conversations several times a year with somebody who says, I think I was born in the wrong body. I want to talk about the trauma that they've experienced. I want to talk about what might have led them to that belief. But I'm starting to sense from our conversation that what I really need to do first is give them a sense of why their body matters. And I'd love to just get some help in those kinds of conversations from you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's absolutely true that more and more as I talk to pastors, church leaders, parents, this is a question across the board of how to navigate these conversations and to do it well. I think one piece is to recognize that oftentimes, I think the tendency, especially if you haven't engaged in these conversations to a great degree, it can be overwhelming to know what to say, how to respond, how to interact and engage. And I think one of the first things to do is not panic, right? Don't panic, but to step back and say, this is in many ways probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on with this person as a whole person, and am I willing to take the time to invest in getting to know them and to know their story so that I can then have a better framework for understanding what is the struggle that they're talking about? What is the sense of dissonance? Is it a sense of, I just don't fit within these cultural stereotypes? Is it something more like a gender dysphoria where there's just a deep disconnection? What's going on there? And to think about how to communicate, again, what you see in scriptures, the goodness of creation, the goodness of bodies, the goodness of how God has made us. And that's not to deny the reality of sin and the fall, but to say there's something deeply good here, that if there is a sense of incongruity or disconnect, um, let's take time to really process where that's coming from, um, and to at least take steps to appreciate the goodness of our bodies, um, before just assuming if I feel a sense of dissonance or disconnect, then the solution is to alter or to change my body. Because honestly, I think that's, again, when we talk about the myths that are out there in the secular culture, I think one of the stories out there is that if you do this, if you alter your body, that's going to make you happy.
Right.
And I think this is where it's interesting to me. There are a number of even non-Christian secular voices saying we need to put the brakes on this, because it's no small thing to alter our bodies, um, especially without even looking at things like medical or psychological best practices here. And so I think when even voices in the secular culture are saying, don't just rush into this, I do think this narrative is, if you just change this, you'll be happy. If you just do this, you'll be happy. And I think what's happening with some of these things, some more than others, is that people are seeing there's a bit of a dead end. It's not actually delivering on its promises. And I think this is where we have to be careful as Christians. Our point isn't, if you believe in Jesus, all your suffering and difficulty is going to go away, right? That's not true either. What does it mean to walk a path that Jesus himself has walked? That the eternal Son of God himself took on a body that I don't know, but I have to imagine there were times when that seemed very limiting or even incongruous with his divine nature. But he entered into that suffering ultimately for the joy set before him. And so I think looking to Jesus as a way forward, which is not a quick fix, it's not what the secular culture might promise in terms of happiness, but I think it is this path of profound resonance of seeing how our bodies are connected to the body of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, that's so helpful because, in working with a lot of young adults, you do talk to guys and they'll, you kind of get the impression they're like, man, this testosterone is really messing me up, or girls, this estrogen is really messing me up. I could be more godly if I didn't have hormones. But we've got to actually address that, because this is top of mind for a lot of young adults in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we can do as Christians is to recognize that even part of the normal path of growing up is to have some of these questions about what's going on with my body. What's my place? Where do I fit? What do I do with sexual desires? How does this all resonate? And I think, I was recently talking with a group of youth leaders, kind of saying, maybe one of the things that's really unhelpful in our culture is this sense of like, at age 15 or age 12 or age whatever, you have to identify with a certain label, because part of growing up is this sense of, I don't fit. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to do in some sense with my body. And so I think having this openness to say, it's okay to, in some sense, feel out of control. It's okay to feel confused to some degree. We can walk this path together, rather than just saying, well, if I just can figure out my identity label, that's going to solve all the problems, make everything clear. And so I think especially working with young adults, teenagers, adolescents, parents, youth leaders really need patience and to take the long view in what that walking with looks like, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. I can see that being an encouragement to parents, especially as they're dealing with this, but with youth pastors who are facing this all of the time. When being trans is seen as being superior,
Yeah.
and let's be honest, that's the way a lot of kids in school are experiencing this. That like the cool kids are trans, like this is a higher place for you to be, rather than
Yeah.
otherwise.
Yeah.
And there is a sense in which we're so disembodied that even those those labels, as you put it, those boxes that people put themselves in, somehow gain moral superiority. It's not just like it's different. It's like it's this is preferred. If I don't identify as male or female, I'm actually like a higher level of being. Are you sensing that?
Yeah, I think the way that I see that unfolding is this almost, as one of my friends puts it at his kids' high school. It's like if you're not bi, you're a bigot, uh, or this sense that, like you said, it's gone from let's think about how do we sort of value all people equally to almost a preferred sense of being on the cutting edge or being sort of ahead of maybe where others are if you just identify as male or female, or things of that nature. And so I do think, yeah, I think in some context, this is where I think it does depend on people's social context, their family context, church context, and others, um, because I think there are contexts where it can be very alienating, very difficult for young people to even acknowledge that maybe there is a sense of incongruity or a sense of I don't fit the cultural stereotype. So I want to do justice both to thinking through the different places in our culture where you have this ideology that's shaping people, as well as being attentive to people on the ground. And I think
Yeah.
that's maybe one of the most, for me, I think I struggle with this, and so I'm guessing maybe others do too. That on the one hand, I see these forces in our culture that I see are just absolutely devastating, misleading, problematic on so many levels. And to remember that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against these principalities and powers, these spiritual forces that really do shape our minds.
Yeah.
And there are people who buy into that, people who promote it, but there are also many people who I think in different ways, almost unbeknownst to them, are formed and shaped by those things. And so being able and willing to deal both at the level of ideas, and be able to critique and in some ways attack and um, really address those concerns. And at the same time, think through how do I walk with the people who might be in front of me looking for Jesus unbeknownst to them. And how do I don't know. So for me, that's a balance, that's a tension,
Yeah.
in thinking about how to do those things well.
Yeah. Well, these are things that churches are going to need to figure out if we want to minister in this kind of climate. We've got to learn how to have these conversations. I know you weren't here as sort of a kidmin person, but I'd be curious if a church was going to try to help children in a sensitive but thoughtful but biblical way become gender secure, recognize that God has created their bodies. How would you recommend that they go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really starting with the building blocks that are in scripture that in some ways we maybe think about or we just take for granted. These basics of God as creator. Yeah, I think about like the New City Catechism and some of the basic questions there. How and why did God create us? God created us male and female in his own image to glorify him. Just even with young kids, memorizing that, saying that is already giving them some core building blocks, that are going to help with that. And so I think to recognize and equip people to talk about even something like the goodness of the body. And again, some of these might be conversations where a kids ministry person is going to want to help equip parents. How do you talk even at a young age, 3, 4, 5, 6, about God made our bodies. Our bodies are good. Our bodies are not something to be ashamed of. We wear clothes not because our body is horrible and disgusting and those kind of things. And so to equip them at that level, and then also to have some of these conversations even around to some degree questions about what does make us male and female. Is it that Johnny likes to play soccer? Well, Susie likes to play soccer too. Is playing sports, like, does that make somebody male or female? No. And so to, in some ways, start to already help them process, in their minds, I think, especially at a young age, thinking very black and white, boys do this, girls do this, boys look like this, girls look like this. So to say that that's not entirely bad, but also to help them start thinking through that so that they don't, at a slightly older age, start saying, oh, well, I want to wear my hair long as a boy, so I must be a girl, because that's kind of the setup that they've received. Right. So those are just a couple ideas.
Well, this is such an important conversation. And as we wrap up, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your current work with the Foundry, because this is providing an avenue of theological education for people who will be lay leaders and even on staff in churches who might not be able to have a traditional seminary education, or maybe even a traditional seminary education might set them aside from the ministry that they currently have. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's a really interesting project.
Yeah. So for 13 years, I taught Bible and theology at Kuyper College here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 2 years ago, myself and 2 colleagues just had a clear leading from the Lord to step into something new. And so really what we do with the Foundry is to provide biblical and practical training for church leaders at every level. And so trying to, in some ways, much of the material that I taught, Bible, theology, ministry, worldview, saying, how do we hit all the people who would love training in this, but who can't afford, don't have access to something like a traditional Bible college or seminary degree. And so really trying to partner with churches, church networks, church leaders to provide learning pathways and learning communities where our goal is really to provide learning communities for leaders at every level. So whether somebody's a veteran pastor, somebody preparing and training for ministry, somebody on staff, or lay leaders, volunteer leaders, to say, let's start creating groups and learning communities where people can grow in a way that's a doable pace for real life, for people who have full-time jobs, people who are in ministry, so who for different reasons maybe don't fit their traditional box, and really trying to provide an opportunity to grow deeper. Because as you well know, it's so crucial for people to be equipped, rooted in Scripture, understanding what it is we believe as Christians, and how we do ministry well in our context. So it's really been a joy the last year and a half, almost 2 years now of stepping into this. And I would just encourage more and more churches to, again, think about leadership as lifelong learning. So no matter where somebody's at, there's always opportunities for continued growth and learning in that way.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I know a lot of the people who are viewing and listening are in the full bloom of their career and their family life. Others are in a transition place where maybe their career or their family situation is now shifting, and they're asking, how can I want to do more with the church. I want to learn more. I want to grow more. I want to have more ministry. So what you're doing is really meeting a need in that way.
Yeah, we love it, and we're grateful for God's leading in this way, and just excited to see what he continues to do.
Well, Branson, thank you for coming on to talk about everybody's story and the issue of how we view sexuality. I think the categories that you've given are so helpful in understanding what we're seeing, and it's so encouraging just to be reminded of a very simple truth that God is the creator and that he's the sustainer and that he's made our bodies as part of what he's called us to do. It's just a great reminder. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you to my guest today, Branson Parler, for coming on the show. You can find the book we talked about, Everybody's Story, wherever books are sold. John's gospel tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. And we observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son of the Father. Jesus was human and remained human after he rose from the dead. If the human body matters that much to God, our bodies matter. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it. And leave a review, if you would, on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week.